Millions of years of evolution, thousands of generations of survival. And yet, these 10 people looked death in the face and said, bet. This isn't a list of accidents. Accidents are when something goes wrong. These are stories of people who engineered their own ending with impressive dedication. 10 master plans, 0 survivors. Nature's quality control working overtime. 1. Spring 2019, the Grand Canyon, Arizona. One of Earth's most breathtaking natural wonders, and as it turns out, a fantastic stage for natural selection. Enter Kevin, a 42-year-old father of 3 whose entire comedic identity peaked somewhere around 7th grade and never recovered. Kevin was what his family politely called the funny one, but what insurance actuaries would flag as high risk. He was the guy still doing jump scares at family dinners, the uncle who thought "got your nose" was hilarious well into middle age, the man who measured the success of a joke by how many people clutched their chests in genuine terror. So when his family gathered at a scenic overlook to appreciate the canyon's majesty, Kevin's brain immediately started calculating how to transform this peaceful moment into psychological trauma. His plan? Hop the safety rail, fake a slip, watch everyone scream, pop back up with a triumphant "gotcha!" In his mind, he was already rehearsing his bow. Let's pause for a quick physics lesson for those who, like Kevin, apparently thought gravity was negotiable. The Grand Canyon is a giant hole that drops up to 6,000 feet. That's over a mile straight down, for the metrically challenged. The safety railings aren't decorative suggestions installed by bureaucrats who hate fun. They're the only thing between you and becoming a very thin layer of organic material on ancient rock. And that ground near the edge? It's loose gravel sitting on crumbling sandstone that's been waiting millions of years to betray someone exactly like Kevin. You following this? Good, because Kevin wasn't. Over the railing he went, his New Balance sneakers crunching onto a ledge that was basically a geological trap card. His wife saw him climb over and rolled her eyes so hard she nearly glimpsed her own brainstem, probably already mentally checking if his life insurance was up to date. His brother-in-law, sensing content, started filming. Future Thanksgiving ammunition, he figured. Kevin got into character. Wide eyes, windmilling arms, the full theatrical package. "Oh no, I'm slipping," he shouted, his voice cracking with fake terror. At this exact moment, Kevin was probably thinking, "I'm a genius. This is peak comedy. They're going to talk about this for years." And you know what? He was half right. They absolutely talk about it, just not the way he imagined. Here's the thing about performing on loose gravel. It's not a stage, it's a trapdoor. His left foot shifted. The pebbles beneath him said, "Actually, no." His theatrical arm flailing suddenly became very real arm flailing. He grabbed for the railing, too far. Grabbed for the rock, crumbled. Grabbed for air, which, as it turns out, makes a terrible handhold. The fake scream became real. The fake fall became real. Gravity, that humorless enforcer of physics, did what it always does. Kevin dropped 400 feet in roughly 6 seconds, hitting the canyon walls on the way down like nature's own pinball machine. His brother-in-law's video ends with 7 seconds of stunned silence, then someone whispering, "I don't think he's joking." Park rangers found Kevin 3 days later. His obituary described him as a man who loved to make people laugh, which was technically accurate. He finally got his wish. His family talks about him at every gathering now. Just not the way he planned. 2. The noise-canceling headphone. A miracle of modern engineering that creates a perfect bubble of musical isolation, blocking out crying babies, construction noise, and, as we're about to learn, the desperate warning horns of approaching freight trains. Meet Marcus, a 36-year-old software developer from Portland whose entire personality was optimization. This man had spreadsheets for his spreadsheets. He meal prepped on Sundays, tracked his sleep cycles to the minute, and genuinely believed that inefficiency was a moral failing. So on a cold November evening in 2021, when Marcus realized that walking home via the road would take 45 minutes but cutting through an active railway tunnel would take 15, his efficiency-obsessed brain made what it considered the only logical choice. The fact that actual trains, big metal ones, moving at deadly speeds, use this tunnel multiple times per hour was apparently filed under acceptable risk in whatever malfunctioning Excel sheet Marcus used for a brain. To make his underground shortcut enjoyable, he popped in his $300 noise-canceling headphones, the ones with industry-leading active noise cancellation, and cranked Slayer to maximum volume. Because nothing says relaxing tunnel walk like thrash metal, drowning out the entire physical world. Now, let's have a quick engineering lesson for anyone who shares Marcus's apparent belief that they can outthink a train. Modern high-speed locomotives aren't the rumbling steam beasts your great-grandfather feared. They're aerodynamic whispers on precision-welded rails specifically designed to minimize vibration and noise pollution. They don't announce themselves. They don't negotiate. They just arrive at 120 miles per hour, like a 200-ton surprise. Marcus's survival plan, and I'm using plan very generously here, was that he'd feel the vibrations through the ground and casually step into a maintenance alcove. You see what's happening here, right? This man brought 19th century assumptions to a 21st century tunnel. And here's the fatal detail. Marcus walked facing the direction of travel, meaning any train would approach from behind. Headphones blasting, eyes forward, back turned to anything trying to kill him. At some point during this walk, Marcus was probably thinking, "This is genius, I'm saving 30 minutes a week. That's 26 hours a year. I could write a productivity blog about this." The train conductor spotted Marcus about 8 seconds before impact. Enough time to lay on the horn with everything he had. Nowhere near enough time to stop a machine that needs a mile to brake. That horn, designed to be heard from half a mile away? Marcus's $300 German engineering deleted it from existence. Slayer screamed on. Marcus walked on. The headlight briefly illuminated the tunnel walls behind him. He never turned around. Foot hit the ground. Then it didn't. The headphones were recovered 30 feet from the scene, still playing, still canceling noise. A perfect little monument to technology serving stupidity. The railway company released a statement reminding people that tunnels aren't walking paths. Marcus's efficiency spreadsheet showed his shortcut saved 28 minutes weekly. The coroner confirmed the train saved him considerably more than that. Specifically, all the minutes he'd ever have again. 3. A warm Saturday evening at the Mapleview County Fair in rural Ohio. The air thick with the smell of funnel cakes, cattle, and decisions that will be regretted by morning. The Ferris wheel spins lazily against an Instagram-perfect sunset, carrying families and awkward first dates to its peak for a romantic view of the parking lot and the livestock pavilion. Wholesome Americana at its finest, which means it's the perfect setting for someone to do something catastrophically stupid. Enter Tyler, a 24-year-old whose dating strategy could be summarized as replace personality with adrenaline. Tyler was the guy who showed up to first dates with rehearsed stories about adventures he never had, who claimed to have almost gone pro in 3 sports he barely played, and who genuinely, sincerely believed that women found near-death experiences more attractive than emotional stability or a 401k. His Tinder match for the evening, a nursing student named Ashley, had committed a fatal error approximately 20 minutes earlier. She casually mentioned the Ferris wheel seemed kind of boring. In Tyler's brain, this wasn't small talk. This was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown. While a normal human might have responded with witty conversation or purchased a deep-fried Oreo, Tyler saw an opportunity for what he internally called the ultimate power move, climbing the Ferris wheel from the outside while it was moving. You can see where this is going, right? Good. Tyler couldn't. Now, quick carnival engineering lesson for anyone who thinks climbing a moving ride is romantic. Ferris wheel frameworks are coated in a permanent layer of industrial grease to keep the mechanisms running. Those handholds that look sturdy from 60 feet below? Decorative trim, bolted on by whoever submitted the lowest bid. These rides get assembled and disassembled so often that structurally sound is less a guarantee and more of a hopeful suggestion. But Tyler didn't research any of this, because research is for people who lack confidence. And confidence was the only thing Tyler had in dangerous abundance. He waited until their gondola reached the bottom, announced his plan with the swagger of a man who had never once experienced consequences, and began climbing. Ashley's protests. Tyler, don't. You're going to die. "I literally met you 3 hours ago on an app," were interpreted as flirtatious encouragement. In his head, Tyler was probably narrating his own movie trailer. They said it couldn't be done. One man, one wheel. One date she'll never forget. Technically accurate on that last part. The first 30 feet went well, fueled by pure adrenaline and desperation. Then, at 50 feet, Tyler's sweaty palms met the grease situation. His grip went from confident to negotiating to begging. You know that moment in cartoons where the character looks down and reality suddenly kicks in? Tyler had that moment. Except this wasn't a cartoon, and there was no convenient cliff edge to grab. His foot slipped, then his hand. Then physics took over. The fall wasn't quick. Ferris wheels are essentially vertical obstacle courses, and Tyler hit every obstacle on the way down. Steel beam, support strut, another beam. The crowd heard sounds they'd spend years trying to forget. He landed on the mechanical housing at the base with a thud that silenced the entire fairground. Ashley, frozen in a gondola at the top, had to be rescued by firefighters an hour later. She deleted Tinder that same night. Tyler's obituary called him adventurous, which honestly wasn't wrong, just incomplete. 4. The high-voltage electrical tower, a marvel of modern infrastructure that brings light to stadiums, powers hospitals, and occasionally serves as the final destination for someone with more rage than brain cells. Our story takes us to Thessaloniki, Greece, on a rainy October evening in 2017, where a crucial soccer match was unfolding and a 44-year-old superfan named Dimitri was about to make sports history in the worst possible way. Dimitri wasn't just a soccer fan. He was the kind of fan other fans pretended not to know. Face painted in team colors by halftime, voice reduced to a hoarse whisper from screaming at players who couldn't hear him, veins bulging with every referee decision like he was personally invested in the outcome, which, knowing Dimitri's gambling habits, he probably was. When the referee awarded a controversial penalty to the opposing team in the 78th minute, something in Dimitri's already unstable mind achieved critical mass. His team was losing. The ref was clearly blind, corrupt, or both. And Dimitri decided that democracy had failed, so direct action was required. His plan, conceived in approximately 4 seconds of pure fury: climb the stadium's main lighting tower, cut the power, stop the game. No electricity, no floodlights, no penalty kick. Elegant, really, if you ignored the part where it was suicidal. Quick electrical engineering lesson for anyone who shares Dimitri's belief that anger makes you immune to physics. High-voltage power lines carry anywhere from 69,000 to 500,000 volts. For context, it takes about 0.1 amps to stop a human heart. These towers carry thousands. Touching one doesn't just kill you, it essentially vaporizes the part of you that made contact. Also, and this is important, water conducts electricity beautifully, and it was raining. The warning signs around the tower featured a helpful diagram of a stick figure being electrocuted, accompanied by the word danger in 3 languages. Dimitri, who spent the climb convincing himself the skull and crossbones symbol was probably just a metal band logo, was not deterred. The ascent was miserable. Rain poured into his eyes. His beer-softened muscles screamed in protest, and his hands kept slipping on the wet metal rungs. Halfway up, gasping for breath, a tiny voice in his head asked, "Is this really worth it?" But Dimitri's larger, dumber voice answered, "You're a hero. They'll name a supporters section after you." He found a rusty metal rod near a maintenance platform, because the universe has a sense of humor, and continued climbing. 60 feet up, soaked to the bone, he reached the main junction box. Below, security guards shouted, his friends shouted. 40,000 fans were now watching him instead of the game. This was his moment. He raised the metal rod like a warrior raising a sword, and swung at the main cable with the confidence of a man who had never once considered consequences. The moment metal touched wire, Dimitri became the brightest object in the stadium. Witnesses said the flash was visible from across the city, a brilliant blue-white arc that turned night into day for a split second. The power did go out, for about 3 seconds before backup generators kicked in. but not before Dimitri's electrified silhouette was permanently burned into the memories of 40,000 spectators and one very traumatized referee. The game resumed 2 hours later. The penalty kick was successful. Dimitri's team lost 2-1. His memorial Facebook page filled with "Rest in Power" comments before someone pointed out the unintentional irony, and the family quietly deleted it. 5. Meet Klaus, a 52-year-old senior zookeeper at the Stuttgart Municipal Zoo who had spent 3 decades convincing himself that he was essentially a Disney princess with a government salary. Klaus didn't just work with animals. He believed he communed with them on a spiritual level that transcended the barrier between species. He talked to the meerkats and interpreted their alarm calls as laughter at his jokes. He sang German folk songs to the hippos and was convinced they swayed in appreciation rather than, being hippos. He once told a new employee, with complete sincerity, that the elephants remembered his birthday. This delusion had been harmless for 30 years because Klaus primarily worked with herbivores and birds, creatures whose fight-or-flight responses leaned heavily toward flight. But in the spring of 2018, budget cuts forced a staff reorganization, and Klaus found himself reassigned to the rhinoceros enclosure. Specifically, he was tasked with sedating a 2-ton male white rhino named Bruno for a routine veterinary examination. Quick zoology lesson for anyone who shares Klaus's belief that large wild animals operate on the power of friendship. The white rhinoceros is essentially 2 tons of armored muscle with the temperament of a startled freight train. Their skin is so thick it can deflect bullets. Germans might appreciate the comparison to a Leopard 2 tank, except the tank is more predictable. They have terrible eyesight, exceptional hearing, and a startle response that involves charging at 30 miles per hour while wielding a horn that can puncture steel. Standard sedation protocol involves a tranquilizer dart gun, fired from outside the enclosure by someone who respects the fundamental unpredictability of wild animals. Klaus had access to this equipment. He chose to ignore it. His reasoning, later documented in witness statements that read like a tragedy written by comedians, was that the dart gun would stress Bruno unnecessarily, and that hand injection would be more humane. He also mentioned, apparently without irony, that Bruno knew his voice and would stay calm for a friend. At this moment, Klaus was probably thinking, "This is what separates the real animal whisperers from the amateurs. They'll write about this in zookeeper journals." They did write about it, just not how he imagined. Klaus entered the enclosure holding a syringe like a birthday candle, approaching Bruno with the confidence of a man whose reality testing had catastrophically failed. Bruno was grazing peacefully, probably contemplating grass and territory in whatever way rhinos contemplate things. Klaus crept closer, narrating his approach in soothing German like he was filming a documentary about himself. "Easy, Bruno. It's just Klaus, your old friend. This won't hurt." The needle went in. Bruno's head came up. And 3 decades of imaginary interspecies friendship evaporated in 0.4 seconds. The rhino didn't charge. Charging requires distance and warning. Bruno simply reacted, swinging his massive head sideways with approximately 2,000 pounds of force behind it. Klaus went down. Bruno, now agitated and confused, did what startled rhinos do. He made sure the threat wasn't getting back up. The zoo's official statement called it a tragic deviation from established safety protocols. Klaus's memorial featured a photo of him smiling next to a sedated Bruno from the previous year, sedated properly that time with a dart gun by someone else. 6. Deep in the frozen wilderness of northern Iceland exists a network of volcanic ice caves so beautiful and so deadly that tour guides make you sign waivers just to photograph them. These aren't friendly tourist caves with handrails and gift shops. They're active geological formations where the temperature hovers around instant hypothermia, and the ceiling is decorated with icicles the size of telephone poles, each one essentially a frozen guillotine waiting for an excuse. It was here, in February 2020, that a 28-year-old adventure tourist named Eric decided that "look but don't touch" was more of a suggestion than a survival requirement. Eric's Instagram account, Extreme Eric Adventures, was a monument to bad decisions that hadn't yet caught up with him. His grid featured photos of himself standing on "Do Not Cross Barriers" at Icelandic waterfalls, touching geysers moments before eruption, and posing next to warning signs with middle fingers raised. His bio read, "Rules are for people who can't handle life." His follower count was modest, but his confidence was not. He was traveling with his best friend Lars, who served primarily as a cameraman and a witness to Eric's eventual demise. The ice cave was magnificent, walls glowing ethereal blue from compressed glacial ice, ceilings studded with crystalline formations that had been growing for decades. The tour guide specifically instructed visitors to stay on marked paths, avoid touching anything, and above all, never stand beneath the larger icicles. Eric heard these instructions and immediately spotted the most impressive icicle in the entire cave. A 6-foot monster, thick as a man's torso, hanging like Damocles' sword made of frozen water. He decided he needed to own it. Quick physics lesson for anyone who thinks ice is just frozen water and therefore harmless. Glacial icicles can weigh hundreds of pounds, with tips compressed sharp enough to puncture metal. They're attached to ceilings by bases that constantly melt and refreeze, meaning their structural integrity is essentially a dice roll at any given moment. Vibrations, like, say, someone throwing rocks at them, accelerate this instability dramatically. Eric positioned himself directly beneath his prize and announced his plan to catch it when it fell. Lars protested. Eric waved him off. "It's just ice, bro. Get your camera ready. This is going to be legendary content." He picked up a rock and threw it at the base. Thunk. Nothing. He threw another. Thunk. The icicle creaked, a sound that should have been a warning but was instead interpreted as encouragement. "It's working," Eric shouted, grabbing a larger rock. Thunk, thunk, crack. That final sound echoed through the cave like a gunshot. The icicle broke free with terrifying speed, and Eric had approximately 1 second to process his mistake. Enough time, according to Lars, for his expression to shift from triumph to confusion to pure terror. The 200-pound spear of solid ice didn't land in his arms. It landed on him. Rescue teams later said they'd never seen anything quite like it. The cave was closed for 3 days while they extracted what remained of Eric from the ice. His Instagram received a surge of followers after the incident. His final unfinished post, a photo of the icicle taken moments before, gathering more engagement than anything he'd posted alive. Lars eventually memorialized the account. The bio now reads, "Rules existed for a reason. Miss you, brother." 7. The $5 baseball cap, a disposable piece of cotton and polyester mass-produced overseas, available at every gas station on the planet. It's the kind of thing you buy because you forgot sunscreen and abandoned in a hotel room without a second thought. Unless you're Sandra, a 39-year-old accountant from Melbourne whose commitment to not wasting money would shortly cost her everything. Our story unfolds on the Great Ocean Road in Victoria, Australia, on a stormy January afternoon in 2019, where Sandra and her family had stopped at a scenic overlook despite weather warnings. The cliffs here are famous for 2 things: breathtaking views and a body count that no longer surprises local rescue teams. When a gust of wind ripped Sandra's kangaroo-emblazoned cap off her head and deposited it on a rocky ledge 20 feet below the safety barrier, her accountant brain kicked into overdrive. You could practically see the spreadsheet forming behind her eyes. Hat, $5. Petrol to drive here, $47. Parking, $12. That cap represented 6% of the day's expenditure, and Sandra had not driven 3 hours to watch 6% blow into the ocean. "It's the principle," she'd have said. The principle, apparently, was that the sea owed her money. Her husband told her to leave it. Her kids begged her to leave it. A German tourist who recognized universal stupidity gestured frantically. The warning sign, featuring a stick figure being yeeted off a cliff, strongly agreed. Sandra did the math one more time and climbed over the barrier. Quick oceanography lesson. Rogue waves are random surges impossible to predict. They don't announce themselves. They simply arrive and sweep everything off exposed rocks. Sandra edged down the algae-slick surface, spray soaking her immediately, fingers going numb, while her brain kept calculating. Dry cleaning, $15. New shoes if ruined, $60. Still worth it for the hat. She reached the ledge, she grabbed the cap. Triumph. 6% recovered. Take that, ocean. Then 12 feet of Pacific Ocean arrived without warning, crashing over the ledge with casual violence. Sandra had 1.5 seconds, enough to clutch the hat tighter, not enough for anything else. The wave hit. The wave retreated. Sandra went with it. Her husband's video shows the wall of white water, a brief glimpse of her arm still holding the cap, then nothing but foam and screaming. Search and rescue found her 3 days later, 6 kilometers south. The hat was never recovered. The ocean collects with interest. The Overlook now has an additional sign, unofficially called the Sandra sign, stating no personal item is worth your life. A message that would have saved Sandra $47,000 in funeral costs, a number she'd have found very upsetting. 8. Have you ever looked at a watermelon and thought, I wonder what would happen if I launched this into the stratosphere and then stood directly underneath it? No? Congratulations. You possess basic survival instincts. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Darren, a 41-year-old backyard engineer from rural Texas, whose YouTube channel was essentially a countdown to tragedy. Darren built things. Not useful things. He had no interest in furniture or home repair, but dangerous things cobbled together from scrap metal, industrial components, and what appeared to be a complete disregard for both physics and mortality. His previous projects included a homemade cannon, destroyed his fence, a jet-powered bicycle, destroyed his neighbor's fence, and a potato launcher so overpowered it shattered a window 3 houses down. His modest subscriber base watched not for the successes, but for the spectacular failures they knew were coming. His latest creation was his masterpiece, a giant slingshot capable of launching heavy objects at least 1,000 feet straight up. The frame was welded from scrap metal he'd salvaged from a demolished barn. The bands were industrial surgical tubing he'd bought in bulk from a medical supply company that really should have asked more questions. The whole thing looked like something a cartoon coyote would order from ACME, and it functioned about as safely. Quick ballistics lesson for anyone who skipped physics class as enthusiastically as Darren. What goes up must come down, and what goes up fast comes down fast, to almost exactly the spot it launched from. A watermelon weighs about 15 pounds. At terminal velocity, that's roughly equivalent to a bowling ball dropped from an airplane. Getting hit by one isn't slapstick comedy. It's a closed-casket funeral. Darren knew none of this, or knew it, and filed it under things that happened to other people. For his grand test, filmed at high noon on a blazing July day, Darren loaded a watermelon into the cradle and aimed straight up, a perfect 90-degree angle, directly above his own head. His friend Mike, operating the camera from what he hoped was a safe distance, suggested maybe Darren should step aside after launching. Darren laughed. I'm gonna track it all the way up and catch it on the way down. Content gold, baby. The launch was spectacular. Darren pulled the release, the surgical tubing snapped forward with a sound like a thunderclap, and the watermelon rocketed skyward like a fruit-based missile. It shrank rapidly, basketball, softball, golf ball, dot, and then disappeared entirely into the blazing white glare of the Texas noon sun, which hung almost directly overhead like a cosmic spotlight on Darren's stupidity. Darren stood rooted to his launch spot, hand shading his eyes, squinting directly into the sun, trying to track his creation. Where is it? I can't see it. Where did... He never finished the sentence. The watermelon, having reached its apex around 500 feet, had already begun its return journey. But Darren, his retinas overwhelmed by direct sunlight, couldn't see anything except blinding white. The dark shape plummeting toward him was invisible against his sun-blasted vision. It struck at approximately 200 miles per hour. Mike's footage ends with a sound he later described as something he'd prefer to forget, followed by several seconds of him apparently unable to process what he'd just witnessed. The video was never uploaded. Local news covered it under the headline, "Texas Man Killed by Own Invention." The slingshot, remarkably, was undamaged. County officials confiscated and dismantled it, calling it the most dangerous homemade device we've seen in 20 years of code enforcement. 9. The piranha, a small, seemingly unimpressive fish with a reputation that far exceeds its size, thanks largely to Hollywood and sensationalized nature documentaries. Most ichthyologists will tell you that piranhas are actually fairly timid, more scavenger than predator, and unlikely to attack healthy humans unprovoked. What those scientists often forget to mention is that unprovoked doesn't include splashing around in their territory with an open wound during feeding hours. This critical nuance was lost on Roberto, a 53-year-old amateur fisherman from Manaus, Brazil, who had spent 3 decades developing the most dangerous trait a person can have near dangerous animals: contempt bred from familiarity. Roberto had been fishing the Rio Negro tributaries his whole life. He'd caught piranhas, eaten piranhas, used them as bait. In his mind, they were just another fish, and the stories about feeding frenzies were nonsense invented by gringos who'd never actually set foot in the Amazon. He loved mocking the nervous tourists who hired local guides, calling them cowards for refusing to swim in certain areas. "Piranhas only eat dead things," was his favorite line. "They're more scared of you than you are of them." He said this often enough that he apparently started believing it was a fact rather than a fatal misunderstanding. On the morning of his last fishing trip, March 2021, Roberto was working a slow-moving tributary with his friend Carlos when disaster struck. His favorite lure, a gaudy $10 plastic frog he'd named Lucky Maria and credited with at least 100 catches, snagged on a submerged log. Any rational person would have cut the line and mourned the loss. The lure was replaceable. The log was in a section of river thick with red-bellied piranhas, a fact both men knew well. But Roberto had history with Lucky Maria. She was irreplaceable, sentimental, practically family. He was not leaving her behind. "Those things won't touch me," Roberto announced, already pulling off his shirt. Carlos, who had known Roberto for 20 years and had long since learned that arguing was pointless, said nothing. He simply watched as Roberto slipped over the side of the boat and disappeared beneath the murky brown water. Here's what Roberto either didn't know or chose to ignore. Piranhas are triggered by 2 things: disturbance and blood. Splashing signals a struggling animal, which means easy meal. Blood, even trace amounts, triggers a feeding response that can escalate rapidly. Roberto, as it happened, had nicked his left palm on fishing line earlier that morning. He'd ignored it because it wasn't that bad. Underwater, the cut reopened. Roberto found Lucky Maria tangled hopelessly around submerged branches. He tugged, he yanked, he thrashed, essentially ringing a dinner bell while bleeding into the water. He surfaced seconds later, holding the lure triumphantly. "Got her!" he shouted to Carlos. Then he felt the first bump against his leg, then the second. Then what felt like dozens of small, sharp pinches happening simultaneously. The water around him, previously calm, had begun to churn. Carlos grabbed an oar, tried to reach him, but the distance was too great. Roberto went under once, came back up with considerably less triumph in his expression, and went under again. The third time, the river simply kept him. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. Recovery teams searched for hours but found only evidence of what had happened, and Lucky Maria, floating peacefully downstream, completely unharmed. Carlos's statement to police became local legend. He got the lure back. He saved it. It's probably still floating out there somewhere, in perfect condition. Roberto isn't. The tributary now features additional warning signs, though locals note they'd been warning tourists about that exact spot for years. Nobody had thought they needed to warn Roberto, because Roberto was supposed to know better. The lure, if it's still out there, remains lucky. Just not for its owner. 10. What happens when you combine internet pseudoscience, zero critical thinking, and a 300-foot cliff drop? Allow me to introduce Vikram, a 34-year-old IT professional from Mumbai who discovered YouTube's wellness rabbit hole and tunneled so deep he came out the other side of sanity. It started innocently enough, a video about meditation, a recommendation for mindfulness techniques, and then the algorithm did what it does best. It radicalized him, one autoplay at a time, into the bizarre world of sun gazing. The channels had names like Solar Consciousness Academy and Cosmic Energy Warriors, featuring self-proclaimed gurus who spoke with absolute confidence about absorbing energy directly from the sun. According to these videos, which Vikram watched religiously for 6 months, staring at the sun during safe hours could unlock mental superpowers, cure chronic diseases, and eventually eliminate the need for food entirely. Humans are meant to photosynthesize, one guru explained, but modern society has taught us to fear our own power source. Real ophthalmologists have a different term for this practice: rapid onset permanent blindness. Vikram called it his awakening. Now, staring at the sun is stupid enough on flat ground with a hospital nearby. But Vikram, ever the overachiever, decided to enhance his practice by meditating on the edge of a cliff in the Western Ghats, reasoning that being closer to the sky would intensify his energy absorption. He also believed that the altitude would reduce atmospheric interference between himself and the sun's healing rays. He got this information from a YouTube comment section, which tells you everything you need to know about his research methodology. Quick biology lesson for anyone tempted to try this at home. Your retinas are not designed to process direct sunlight. Extended exposure causes solar retinopathy, permanent damage to the photoreceptor cells that allow you to see. After about 20 minutes of direct sun gazing, you won't just see spots. You'll be functionally blind, unable to distinguish shapes, movement, or, critically, where solid ground ends and empty air begins. The human balance system relies heavily on visual input. Remove that input suddenly, and your brain loses its reference points for up and down. Vikram's final morning began at sunrise. He hiked to his usual spot, a scenic overlook he'd discovered on Google Maps, featuring a narrow ledge about 2 feet from a sheer 300-foot drop, and settled into position. Hikers who passed him later reported he seemed peaceful, which in retrospect was less spiritual achievement and more progressive neurological damage. He stared into the rising sun, absorbing what he believed was cosmic energy, but was actually irreversible retinal destruction. 20 minutes in, his vision went blurry. Then white. Then essentially nothing. Just vague shapes and an overwhelming brightness that wouldn't fade even with his eyes closed. His balance began to fail. He wobbled. He tried to steady himself, but steady was now a concept without visual reference. His damaged brain interpreted a slight forward lean as backward movement. He corrected by stepping forward. His body was found by hikers that afternoon, 300 feet below his meditation spot. Investigators pieced together his final morning through journal entries and YouTube history, a digital trail that read like a roadmap to self-destruction. The wellness channels he'd followed never acknowledged his death. They're still posting videos about solar consciousness to their remaining subscribers. The comment section beneath his last watched video features someone asking, "Has anyone actually died from this?" Nobody answered. All right, confession time. Drop in the comments the dumbest thing you've done that could have landed you in a video like this. Anonymous accounts welcome. No judgment, just science. Like if you recognize someone you know in these stories. Subscribe before natural selection catches up. See you in the next episode, assuming you make it.